Hampshire.
Madam President, I want to rise to talk about the same issue that the senator from Georgia has just discussed. And first, I want to congratulate the senator of Georgia, and this is the point that we've been making on our side of the aisle. He's come up with a very thoughtful and appropriate way to address what was one of the core drivers of our fiscal meltdown in this country. If you look at what caused the financial crisis of late 2008, which has caused us significant recession, which has caused us to go through all these expenditures as a government, and which has caused so many American people to have to suffer the consequences of this recession, there were 3 or 4 major events that generated this. One was money was too cheap for too long, and that was a Federal Reserve decision. But right at the essence of it was the issue of underwriting, the fact that there was a decoupling of the people who were making the loan from the people who were responsible for the loan. And you had this whole service industry built up that was making money off of the fees for originating the loan, and we really weren't that concerned about the ability of the person to repay the loan or the underlying asset. What the senator from Georgia has pointed out, and the proposal that he's brought forward, is a very responsible way to address this fundamental problem which we have, which is the failure of underwriting. And that's the point we've been making on our side of the aisle, that we have a whole series of what we think are pretty good ideas as to how you can make financial reform work better. Now, I was impressed, and certainly one of them is the idea from the senator from Georgia. Well, I was impressed today to hear both the leaders say that they want to have a bill that's bipartisan, that's comprehensive, that's thoughtful, and that addresses the issues which we confront in this regulatory arena. Unfortunately, that's not the atmosphere around here that's been created. Regrettably, there's been a huge amount of hyperbole, especially in the last couple of weeks. Most of it has not been directed at moving down a path of thoughtful and mature and substantive approach to this issue. Most of it has been addressed at raising anecdotal events, which have then been hyperbolized into single one-liners as to how you address them. Well, this issue of financial reform is far too complicated for one-liners. That's just the fact. It's an extremely complex undertaking to make sure that we accomplish what we need to accomplish in regulatory reform. Our goal should be 2. First, we should do whatever we can to restructure the regulatory arena so that we reduce, to the greatest extent possibly, the potential of another systemic risk event. And I'll talk about what we need to do in that area in a second. And second, while we're doing that, we have to make sure that the regulatory environment that we put in place keeps America as the best place in the world to create capital and get a loan for people who are willing to go out and take a risk, be entrepreneurs, and create jobs. You know, one of the great uniquenesses of our culture, what makes us different from so many other places in this world, what gives us such vibrance and energy as an economic engine, is that we have people who are willing to go out and take risks. We have people who are willing to be entrepreneurs. And we have a system of capital formation and credit which makes capital and credit readily available to those individuals at reasonable prices. And so as we go down this road of regulatory reorganization, we've got to make sure we don't suffocate that great strength of our nation. And so there are 4 basic issues before us today in the issue of regulatory reform, and none of them are partisan. And yet the atmosphere around here, you'd think they were all partisan, especially the president's recent speech, which was really over the top in its partisan dialect. The first is how you end too big to fail. Now, we cannot allow a system to exist where there is a belief out there in the markets that the taxpayers are going to back up a company that has taken too many risks and has gotten itself in trouble. Why is that? Because if that happens, if there is a belief in the market that the taxpayers will step in and back up companies that are very large and systemic when they've taken too much risk and put themselves in dire economic straits, if there's a belief that the taxpayer is going to step up and back that company up, capital will get perverted. Capital will not be efficiently used. Capital will flow in an inefficient way to companies which have proved themselves to not be fiscally responsible. And that's not a good way for an economy to function, and certainly a market economy to function. And so we have to end too big to fail. Now, this isn't a partisan debate. Senator Dodd has brought forward a bill which he thinks ends too big to fail. In my view, it doesn't. It has some serious flaws. It's a good attempt, but it doesn't get there. Senator Corker and Senator Warner, two different parties, have actually put together a concept, we call it resolution authority around here, which actually does end too big to fail and does it the right way. It essentially says if an entity which is a huge entity, gets out of whack, overextends itself, gets too much risk, no longer viable, well, then we're going to resolve that company. The stockholders will be wiped out, unsecured bondholders will be wiped out, and the company will basically flow into bankruptcy and will not be conserved. Will not be conserved. And so that's a good approach, and it's a bipartisan approach. Another big issue, how you address regulatory oversight to try to anticipate a systemic event. Well, again, the Dodd bill makes an attempt in this area, but there are ways that we can improve it. We need to have all the different regulators who have an important role in this sitting at a table, most likely led by the Fed, who take a look at the broad horizon of what's happening in the marketplace and say, okay, in this area we've got a problem rising. We got too many people doing too many things which are at the margin of responsibility here. We're going to empower the agency which is responsible for that, the FDIC or the OCC or one of the other regulatory agencies, to go out and make sure that that activity ceases or is abated, and they're going to come back and report to us so that you've got some oversight here. That's the concept, and it can be fleshed out in better terms. And it goes to this issue, which is raised by the senator from Georgia, which is that we should have better underwriting standards as part of this exercise so that in the marketplace of real estate, especially residential real estate, we get back to the approach that we should have taken to begin with, which is that we know that the asset value that's being lent to exists and that the person can pay the loan back as the loan is adjusted over the years. Thirdly, we've got the issue of derivatives. Derivatives are a huge part of the market today. Massive. You know, the number is $600 trillion of notional value, something like that. Just massive numbers. Well, what do? They basically make it possible for American companies, especially, to sell their products around the world or to take and put their products into the market in a way that they're able to address issues which they don't have control over. For example, if you're Caterpillar Equipment and you're selling something in China, you don't know if the currency is going to change. What do you do with China? Let's say that's a bad example. If you're selling something in Brazil, you don't know if the currency value is going to change. You don't know if there's going to be a change in the cost of your materials that you're building that tractor with. You don't know a lot of different factors you don't have control over. So derivatives allow you to insure over that. That's a simple statement of what derivatives do. But that goes to all sorts of different activity, from financial entities all the way across the board to producers of goods. And so there needs to be a regime put in place that makes these derivatives sounder, where we don't get an AIG type of situation, where basically backing up what amounts to an insurance policy was a company with a name but actually no assets. And so myself and Senator Jack Reed from Rhode Island have been working for months, literally months, on a daily basis to try to work out such a regime. And we think we're pretty close. We think it's going to be a good proposal. Nobody's going to like it, which we know means it's going to be a good proposal. But it's going to accomplish what we need to do, which is get more transparency, get more liquidity and margin in the market. And there'll be the opportunity to have end users who are exempt, but there will also be a primary incentive to put people on a clearinghouse. And to the extent you can move from a clearinghouse to an exchange, that'll happen also, without undermining the market. But the key here is to put in place a regime which doesn't force companies to go overseas to do their derivative activity. I mean, this is a very fluid event. And if we come forward with an overly regressive approach here, an overly bureaucratic approach, one which basically responds to a hyperbole of the moment, which is that all derivatives are bad and not transparent and therefore must be put on exchanges, something like that, we're basically going to push offshore the vast amount of derivative activity that is critical to our industry in America being competitive. And really, as a very practical matter, if we can develop a sound market, we want to be, and we can develop a sound market, we want to be the nation where most people go to develop their derivatives, because it's a big industry and it's something we should keep on shore. Third issue, consumer protection. My time is up. Fourth issue.
The senator has used 10 minutes.
I see where the senator from Louisiana wants to speak. But the point here is pretty obvious. This is not a partisan issue. We can resolve the issue of financial regulatory reform if we sit down and do it in a constructive, thoughtful way, step back, be mature, and take an approach that's thoughtful as versus wrapped in hyperbole and populism of the moment. And I certainly hope we'll take that process and go forward. I yield the floor.